A young nurse got pregnant by a homeless man she met at the clinic. Everyone laughed at her. But when a luxury SUV stopped in front of her house, they were shocked by what they saw. The clinic buzzed with its usual rhythm of organized chaos. Phones rang off the hook, patients shuffled in and out of crowded waiting rooms, and the fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. Grace moved through it all with a practiced ease, her white sneakers squeaking softly against the linoleum floor as she carried a clipboard in one hand and a tray of supplies in the other. Her shift had started hours ago, but she barely noticed the time. Every patient she saw, whether it was a crying toddler with a fever or an elderly man struggling to breathe, reminded her why she had chosen this work. Grace, one of the nurses, called out, motioning toward the front desk. Another walk-in just came in for triage. Grace nodded, adjusting her ponytail as she made her way toward the lobby. She was used to the unpredictability of working at the free clinic, where anyone and everyone could show up seeking care. But when she stepped into the waiting area, she paused. All eyes were on the man standing near the door. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that hinted at a life full of hard lessons. His clothes were worn and dirty, his beard unkempt, and his hair matted under a knit cap. In his hands he clutched a threadbare backpack, holding it as though it contained everything he owned. The murmurs started almost immediately. "What's he doing here?" one woman whispered loudly to her companion. "I hope they don't think we're sharing a waiting room with him," another muttered, her nose wrinkling in distaste. Grace felt a familiar pang in her chest, a mixture of anger and sadness. She moved toward the man, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, can I help you?" The man's sharp blue eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of hesitation. Then, as if steeling himself, he straightened. "I need to see a doctor," he said, his voice rough but steady. Before Grace could respond, one of her colleagues approached, her expression tight with disapproval. "Grace," the other nurse whispered, her voice low but loud enough for the man to hear, "we can't just let people like this take up space in the clinic. We have other patients to think about." Grace turned to her colleague, her tone clipped. "He's a patient too, and I'll take care of him." The nurse frowned but didn't argue, walking away with a huff. Grace turned back to the man, offering him a small smile. "Come with me. Let's get you checked in." She led him to an empty exam room, gesturing for him to sit on the worn-out cot. He did so reluctantly, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he were bracing for judgment. "Name?" Grace asked, her pen poised over the clipboard. "Daniel," he said after a moment. "Daniel Marks." She nodded, jotting it down. "Okay, Daniel. What brings you in today?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. "I haven't been feeling right. Weak, dizzy. Probably just need to eat more," but he trailed off, his voice tinged with self-deprecation. Grace softened. "We'll figure it out. Let me take your vitals first." As she worked, Daniel watched her closely, his gaze scrutinizing but not unkind. When she placed a thermometer in his ear, he spoke, his tone laced with skepticism. "Why are you doing this?" Grace glanced at him, confused. "Doing what?" "Helping me," he said bluntly. "You don't know me, and it's not like anyone else here wanted me around." Her grip on the thermometer tightened briefly before she placed it back on the tray. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. Daniel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "The right thing? Is that what you tell yourself so you can feel good about saving people like me?" Grace froze for a split second, the jab landing harder than she expected. But when she looked at him, she didn't see malice, just pain, buried beneath layers of sarcasm and self-defense. "I help you," she said quietly but firmly, "because I want to. Not because I need to prove anything to myself or anyone else." For the first time, Daniel seemed taken aback. He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and looked away. Grace let the silence linger for a moment before continuing with her assessment. She could feel the weight of his mistrust, the walls he had built to keep the world at bay. But she also saw the flicker of vulnerability, the small crack that told her he wasn't as unreachable as he wanted to seem. As she finished, she stepped back, her clipboard in hand. "We'll run some basic tests and make sure everything's okay. In the meantime, I'll get you some water and something to eat." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You don't give up, do you?" She smiled faintly. "Not usually." As Grace left the room, she heard Daniel mutter under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Her heart swelled slightly, a small victory in a long day of battles. She didn't know what Daniel's story was yet, but something told her it was far from over. The morning sunlight streamed through the clinic's windows, casting long, golden streaks across the waiting room floor. Grace stood at the reception desk, organizing patient files, when she overheard snippets of conversation from her colleagues behind her. "Why does she waste her time here?" one nurse whispered to another, glancing in Grace's direction. "I don't get it either," the other replied with a snide chuckle. "She's smart enough to work in a real hospital, make decent money. Instead, she's stuck here cleaning up after people who can't even pay their bills." Grace kept her face neutral, her hands steady as she continued with her work. She was used to the whispers, the subtle jabs about her choice to work at the free clinic. But she had her reasons. Her mind wandered briefly to her mother, who was at home resting in the small apartment they shared. The mounting medical bills, the late-night worry, the exhaustion, it all weighed on Grace, but she refused to let it show. Her job at the clinic wasn't glamorous or lucrative, but it gave her purpose. It reminded her that even in the midst of struggle, kindness could still make a difference. The bell over the clinic door jingled, pulling Grace from her thoughts. She turned to see Daniel walking in, his shoulders hunched as he avoided the judgmental stares of the patients and staff. "Back again," one of the nurses muttered under her breath. "Does he even need medical help, or is he just here for a free handout?" Another snickered. Grace's jaw tightened, but she ignored them, stepping forward to greet Daniel. "Hi, Daniel," she said warmly. "Come on back. We'll get you checked out." He hesitated, glancing around the room at the disapproving faces. "You sure I'm not bothering you?" "You're not bothering me," Grace said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. In the exam room, Grace went through the usual routine, checking Daniel's vitals, asking about his symptoms, and jotting down notes on his chart. "Your blood pressure's a little better today," she said with a small smile. "Have you been eating more regularly?" Daniel shrugged, his eyes flickering with discomfort. "I've been trying. Not always easy." Grace nodded, her tone gentle. "I understand. I brought some protein bars and vitamins for you last time. Did those help?" Daniel glanced away, his jaw tightening. Yeah, they helped. Thanks." "You don't have to thank me," Grace said softly. Daniel looked at her then, his sharp blue eyes searching her face. "Why do you keep doing this?" Grace paused, setting the stethoscope down on the counter. "Doing what?" "Helping me," he said, his voice low. "You barely know me, and I'm not exactly the kind of person most people go out of their way for." She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Because I can see that you're trying, Daniel. And I think everyone deserves someone in their corner." His lips twitched, a faint smile threatening to appear but never quite making it. "You're too good for this place, you know. For people like me." "Maybe," Grace said lightly. "But I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Daniel's visits became more frequent over the next few weeks, and Grace began to notice things about him that others overlooked. He spoke with a certain precision, choosing his words carefully, as if he were used to commanding attention. And while his clothes were worn, there was a neatness to him, a sense of pride he refused to let go of, no matter how dire his circumstances. One day, as Grace brought him a fresh prescription and a bag of groceries she had purchased herself, Daniel finally opened up. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and guilt. "I know," Grace replied, handing him the bag, "but I want to." He hesitated, then sighed. "I wasn't always like this." Grace sat down across from him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "I used to have a life. A good one. A career, a family, a house with a view of the bay. And then it all fell apart." "What happened?" she asked gently. He looked down at his hands, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. "I trusted the wrong people. Lost everything in a bad deal. And when things got hard, the people I thought cared about me disappeared. It's funny how quickly people forget you when you're not useful to them anymore." Grace's chest tightened as she listened. "I'm sorry, Daniel. That must have been incredibly hard." He nodded, his jaw clenching. "It was. But you don't need to feel sorry for me, Grace. I don't need pity." "It's not pity," she said softly. "It's compassion." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he let out a small, bitter laugh. "You're different, Grace. I don't know why, but you are." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe I just see something in you that you've forgotten about yourself." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost, hope. But outside the exam room, the whispers among her colleagues continued. And Grace, though steadfast in her belief in Daniel, couldn't help but wonder how long she could shoulder the judgment of others while trying to help a man who refused to let anyone fully in. The sharp sound of laughter echoed down the dimly lit alleyway, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. Grace clutched her grocery bag tighter as she quickened her pace. It was late, and the streets weren't the safest at this hour. Just as she turned the corner, her heart froze. A group of teenagers surrounded someone, their jeers and taunts ringing out. In the middle of the circle, slumped on the ground, was Daniel. "Leave him alone," Grace shouted, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her chest. The teenagers turned to her, momentarily startled. One of them sneered. "What's it to you, lady?" "I said, leave him alone," Grace repeated, stepping closer. Her eyes burned with anger as she met their gazes. "Or do you want me to call the police?" That was enough to make them scatter, their mocking laughter fading as they disappeared into the night. Grace dropped to her knees beside Daniel, her hands hovering uncertainly. His lip was split, and a bruise was forming on his cheek. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He blinked up at her, his sharp blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. "I've been better," he muttered, trying to push himself up. "Don't move," Grace said, her tone firm. "I'm taking you home." Back at her apartment, Grace guided Daniel to the couch. He winced as he sat, the motion pulling at his bruised ribs. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, watching as she rummaged through her first aid kit. "I wasn't going to leave you out there," Grace replied, kneeling in front of him. She gently dabbed at the cut on his lip with a damp cloth, her touch careful but determined. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "You have a habit of saving me, don't you?" Grace paused, meeting his gaze. Someone has to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room shifted, growing heavier, but not unpleasantly so. "Why were you out there?" Grace asked finally. Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I was looking for work," he admitted. "Nothing official, just odd jobs. But I guess I didn't look desperate enough for people to bother hiring me." Grace frowned, her heart aching at his words. "You don't have to do this alone, Daniel." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You think I want to be a burden? I've already lost everything, my career, my family. The last thing I need is to be someone's charity case." "It's not charity," Grace said firmly. "It's compassion. There's a difference." Daniel shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't get it, Grace. I wasn't always like this. I used to have a life. A good one." "Then tell me," she said softly. "Help me understand." He hesitated, the walls he had built around himself faltering. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "I was a businessman," he began. "I started my own company from scratch. Worked my way up, made deals, built something I was proud of. But then I got too trusting. I let the wrong people in, and they ruined me. Stole everything I'd worked for." Grace listened intently, her heart breaking as he continued. "And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident." His voice cracked and he looked away, his jaw tightening. After that, it didn't matter anymore. None of it did. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." He let out a shaky breath, his gaze returning to hers. "It's why I don't tell people about my past. They either pity me or look at me like I'm a failure. I can't stand it." Grace reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "I don't think you're a failure, Daniel. I think you're stronger than you realize." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any hint of insincerity. When he found none, he gave her a small, almost vulnerable smile. "Thanks," he said softly. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of clinking metal outside. She peered through the window and saw Daniel crouched beside her old car, tools spread out around him. "What are you doing?" she asked as she stepped outside, pulling her jacket tighter against the morning chill. "Fixing your car," he replied without looking up. Grace frowned. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, glancing at her. "It's the least I can do." Despite her protests, Daniel spent the next 2 hours tuning the engine, tightening bolts, and even replacing a worn-out belt. When he finally wiped his hands on a rag and stood, he grinned. "Try it now," he said, stepping back. Grace slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, smoother than it had sounded in months. She looked at Daniel in astonishment. "How did you?" "Old hobby," he said with a shrug, his grin widening. Grace stepped out of the car, her chest swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. This means so much to me." "It's nothing," he said, but his tone was softer, almost shy. As they stood there, the sunlight casting a warm glow over them, Grace felt a shift in the air. The connection between them, once tentative and fragile, now felt solid and undeniable. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner in Grace's small kitchen, the walls they had both built around their hearts came crashing down. The laughter, the lingering glances, the quiet moments of vulnerability, it all culminated in a kiss that neither of them saw coming but couldn't resist. And that night, in the quiet sanctuary of her home, they found solace in each other's arms, their hearts beating as one for the first time in years. The morning started like any other. Grace sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea as sunlight streamed through the window. But as she lifted the cup to her lips, the familiar wave of nausea hit her again, stronger this time. She barely made it to the sink before the tea came back up. Leaning against the counter, she wiped her mouth with trembling hands, her heart pounding. This wasn't the first time she had felt like this in the past few weeks, and deep down, she already knew what it meant. Later that afternoon, she sat in the tiny bathroom of the clinic, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands. Two bold pink lines stared back at her, undeniable and life-changing. Grace's breath hitched as she leaned back against the wall, the weight of the moment crashing over her. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, the whispers of her colleagues, the judgmental stares of her neighbors, the mounting bills, and most of all, the baby. After the initial shock subsided, she placed a hand over her stomach. "You're here," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And I'm going to protect you, no matter what." The news spread quickly, as things often did in their small, tight-knit community. Grace had always been the quiet, dependable nurse, admired for her dedication but not immune to gossip. "She's pregnant by that homeless guy, isn't she?" one of her colleagues whispered in the staff lounge. "Can you believe it?" another chimed in. "She's ruined her life for someone like him." In the grocery store, Grace felt the weight of the stares, the whispers that followed her down every aisle. Poor thing, she had so much potential. She'll never recover from this. Grace forced herself to keep her head high, her hands steady as she paid for her groceries. But as soon as she was home, she collapsed onto her couch, her chest heaving with silent sobs. She knew the judgment would come, but the reality of it was harsher than she had anticipated. Still, she refused to let their words break her. The only person who hadn't reached out was Daniel. Since the night they had shared, he had grown distant. At first, Grace thought he was giving her space, but as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't ignore his absence any longer. Finally, she went looking for him. She found him in the park where he often spent his afternoons, sitting on a worn bench beneath the shade of a tree. He looked up as she approached, his expression conflicted. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and hurt, "why have you been avoiding me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Grace, I didn't mean to." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice firmer now. "Don't tell me you didn't mean to. I deserve the truth." Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm not avoiding you. I don't know how to face you." "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because I'm pregnant." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "You're pregnant?" "Yes," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "And I wasn't going to tell you like this, but you left me no choice. I needed you, Daniel, and you disappeared." Daniel's shoulders sagged, and he buried his face in his hands. "Grace, I'm sorry. I didn't know." He trailed off, his voice cracking. "Why did you leave?" she asked softly, stepping closer. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with anguish. "Because you deserve better than me. Better than a man who can't even take care of himself, let alone a child." "Don't you think that's for me to decide?" she said, her voice trembling with both anger and desperation. Daniel shook his head. "I've already dragged you into my mess, Grace. I've seen how people look at you now, how they talk about you. I couldn't stand to make it worse." Grace knelt in front of him, her hands gripping his. "Daniel, listen to me. I don't care what they say. This is my life, my choice. And I chose you. I chose us." He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "You deserve so much more, Grace. I don't know how to be the man you need me to be." "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You just have to try. For me, and for this baby." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, he nodded, his grip tightening on her hands. "I'll try, Grace. I promise I'll try." That night, as they walked back to her apartment, the silence between them was heavy, but no longer uncomfortable. Grace felt a flicker of hope, small but steady, that they could face the challenges ahead together. And though the road would be long and filled with uncertainty, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't be walking it alone. The kitchen was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Grace stood by the sink, washing dishes with mechanical precision, her mind heavy with the weight of their last conversation. Daniel sat at the small table, staring at his clasped hands, his usual sharp wit replaced by brooding silence. Finally, Grace turned off the water and faced him. "We need to talk, Daniel." He looked up, his expression guarded. "I know." She took a deep breath, crossing her arms. "I need to know where you stand. Not just with me, but with this baby. Because I can't do this alone, Daniel. I won't." "I never said you had to," he replied, his voice low. "But you haven't said much of anything," Grace shot back. "You keep running away, pushing me aside, and I can't keep chasing you down. This is your child too. I need to know that you'll be here for both of us." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "You don't understand, Grace. I'm not the kind of man who can give you the life you deserve. I've got nothing to offer." "That's not true," Grace said firmly, stepping closer. "You've got so much more to offer than you think, Daniel. You're smart, resourceful, and deep down you care more than anyone else I've ever met." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Care doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't pay bills. And it sure as hell doesn't erase the fact that I've screwed up every chance I've ever been given." Grace's voice softened, but her determination didn't waver. "I don't care about your past, Daniel. I don't care about the mistakes or the failures. I care about who you are now and who you can be. This baby doesn't need you to be perfect. It just needs you to be present." Daniel slammed his fist against the table, his frustration boiling over. "And what if I can't be that? What if I fail you, Grace? Or worse, fail the baby?" Grace flinched at his outburst but didn't back down. "You don't get to decide that, Daniel. You don't get to take yourself out of the equation just because you're scared." "Scared?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Of course I'm scared. I've already lost everything once, Grace. Do you know what that feels like? To watch everything you've built, everything you've loved, crumble in front of you." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've spent my whole life holding things together that felt like they were falling apart. I know how it feels to be scared, Daniel, but you don't see me giving up." He stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "Maybe you're stronger than me," he muttered. "That's not true," Grace countered. "You're stronger than you realize. You just have to stop running long enough to see it." Daniel stopped pacing, his back to her. "I don't know if I can, Grace. I don't know if I'm good enough for you, or for this baby." Her voice softened again, a note of pleading creeping in. "You are good enough, Daniel. But I can't make you believe that. Only you can." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, without another word, Daniel grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, leaving Grace standing alone in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. The night was cold as Daniel walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind a storm of self-doubt and regret. Grace's words echoed in his head, each one a reminder of the life he could have, if only he had the courage to fight for it. As he passed a familiar building, he stopped, staring up at the glowing sign, Harborview Investments. It had been years since he'd last stepped through those doors, but he knew this was where his life had fallen apart, and where he had to start rebuilding. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed the door open and stepped inside. The next day, Grace sat on the couch, her hands resting on her growing belly. She hadn't slept much, her mind replaying their argument over and over. She wanted to believe in Daniel, to trust that he would find his way back to her, but the weight of uncertainty was crushing. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, her breath caught. Daniel stood there, his eyes weary but determined. He was holding a folder, its edges worn from use. "Can I come in?" he asked hesitantly. Grace stepped aside, her heart pounding. Once inside, Daniel handed her the folder. "I went back to Harborview," he said. Grace looked at him in surprise. "You went back to your old company?" "They weren't exactly thrilled to see me," he admitted with a small, self-deprecating smile. "But I talked to one of the guys I used to work with. Told him I was looking for a second chance. He didn't promise anything, but he agreed to take a look at a business proposal I put together." Grace opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages filled with meticulous notes and financial projections. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Daniel, this could really work." He shrugged, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "It's a long shot, but it's a start. I can't promise I'll succeed, Grace. but I can promise I'll try. For you and for the baby." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she set the folder down and stepped closer to him. "That's all I've ever wanted, Daniel. For you to try." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. "I'm sorry I walked out last night. I was scared, but that's no excuse. You and this baby deserve better." "And you're already becoming better," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel pulled her into a gentle embrace, his arms wrapping around her protectively. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could be the man they needed him to be. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, Daniel placed his hand over Grace's belly. The baby kicked lightly, and for the first time, Daniel smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "We've got this," he said softly, looking into Grace's eyes. And for the first time, Grace truly believed him. The weeks that followed were a blur of cautious hope and quiet determination. Grace continued her work at the clinic, her growing belly a constant reminder of the life she and Daniel were preparing for. Though she saw him less often, she knew he was working on something important. "I promise I'll make this right," he had told her one evening, his eyes steady with resolve. Grace had smiled, placing her hand over his. "I know you will, Daniel. I believe in you." Daniel spent long hours pounding the pavement, his worn shoes a testament to his relentless drive. He knocked on doors, reached out to old contacts, and reconnected with people from a life he had thought was long behind him. Most of them dismissed him, their polite smiles thinly veiling their doubts. But one afternoon in a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, Daniel found a spark of hope. "Daniel Marks," the man across the table said, leaning back in his chair. "It's been a while." "Too long, Paul," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling in his chest. Paul had been a colleague years ago, back when Daniel was at the height of his career. Though they had lost touch after Daniel's fall from grace, Paul had always been one of the few who treated him with genuine respect. "So," Paul said, folding his arms, "what brings you to me after all these years?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment before sliding a folder across the table. "I have an idea." "A good one. And I need your help to make it happen." Paul opened the folder, his eyes scanning the detailed business plan Daniel had spent weeks perfecting. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Finally, Paul looked up, his expression thoughtful. "This is solid," he said, "really solid. But tell me, why should I take a chance on you, Daniel? You've been out of the game for a long time." Daniel met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "Because no one knows what it's like to lose everything better than I do. And no one will fight harder to make this work. I'm not asking for charity, Paul. I'm asking for a chance to prove myself." Paul studied him for a moment longer before breaking into a slow smile. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. All right, Daniel, let's do this." Grace noticed the change in Daniel almost immediately. Though he didn't share many details, there was a new energy about him, a spark she hadn't seen in years. "You've been busy," she teased one evening as they shared a quiet dinner. "You could say that," he replied with a small smile. "But it's all going to be worth it. Just wait." A few weeks later, Daniel showed up at the clinic unexpectedly. Grace's heart skipped a beat when she saw him standing by the entrance, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed almost foreign compared to the worn clothes he used to wear. "Daniel," she said, stepping outside, "what's going on?" He smiled, his confidence radiating in a way that took her breath away. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. Grace hesitated, glancing back at the clinic. "I have patience." "Your shift just ended," he interrupted gently. "I checked." She laughed softly, shaking her head as she took his hand. "All right. Where are we going?" "You'll see," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Daniel led Grace to a sleek, modern office building in the heart of downtown. As they stepped inside, she felt a surge of nervous anticipation. He guided her to a conference room where a group of professionals waited, their conversations halting as the two entered. "This is Grace," Daniel said, introducing her with pride. "The reason I'm standing here today." Grace blinked, stunned. "Daniel, what is this?" One of the men, whom Grace recognized as Paul from a distant memory Daniel had shared, stepped forward with a smile. "This," Paul said, "is the beginning of something incredible. Daniel has been working tirelessly on a project that I believe will change the game for a lot of people. And none of it would have been possible without you." Grace turned to Daniel, her eyes filling with tears. "You did this?" "I did this for us," he said, his voice steady. "For you, for the baby, and for the life we're building together. I told you I'd make it right, Grace, and I meant it." The room erupted in applause, but for Grace, the noise faded into the background. All she could see was Daniel, the man who had faced his demons, fought his way back, and stood before her now, more determined and hopeful than ever. Later that evening, as they sat together on the rooftop of the office building, watching the city lights twinkle below, Grace rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "You've come so far," she whispered. "We've come so far," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they gazed out at the horizon, their hearts full and their future bright, Grace knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise, love, and endless possibilities. The late afternoon sun bathed the small neighborhood in a warm glow as Grace sat on the porch steps of her modest home. Her hands rested on her growing belly, her mind drifting between anticipation and uncertainty. It had been weeks since Daniel had first introduced her to his business partners, and though he assured her things were moving forward, she hadn't seen him much since. A faint rumble broke through the quiet street, drawing her attention. She looked up just as a sleek, black SUV rolled to a stop in front of her house. The polished vehicle stood out starkly against the aging cars parked along the curb, and Grace's heart skipped a beat. The door opened, and Daniel stepped out. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Gone was the man she had first met at the clinic, worn and weary. In his place stood someone transformed, a confident, sharply dressed businessman with an air of quiet determination. But as his eyes met hers, she saw the same Daniel she had always known, kind, resilient, and unmistakably hers. "Daniel?" she whispered, rising to her feet. He smiled, his gaze softening as he approached. "Hey, Grace." Before she could say another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Dropping to one knee, he opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring that sparkled in the sunlight. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Grace," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotion flickering in his expression. "You are the reason I found my way back to myself. You believed in me when no one else did, even when I didn't believe in myself. I don't have all the answers, and I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but I can promise this: I will love you with everything I have. I will stand by you and our child always." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek as Daniel continued. "Will you marry me, Grace? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving how much you mean to me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, with a trembling smile, Grace nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Daniel, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, rising to pull her into his arms. The neighbors, who had gathered silently to witness the scene, erupted into cheers and applause. But for Grace and Daniel, the rest of the world faded away. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's business venture flourished. With Paul's support and Daniel's unwavering determination, they launched a small but promising company focused on helping struggling entrepreneurs get back on their feet. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel, who poured his heart into the work, knowing firsthand how it felt to lose everything and rebuild from the ground up. Grace continued her work at the clinic, her love for helping others undiminished. But now, she had a newfound sense of security and support. Daniel insisted on accompanying her to her doctor's appointments, his excitement about becoming a father evident in the way he asked endless questions and carefully studied every ultrasound image. One crisp autumn evening, Grace and Daniel sat together in their newly furnished living room, the warmth of a crackling fire filling the space. Grace cradled her newborn son, his tiny fingers wrapped around her own. Daniel sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, gazing down at their child with a mixture of awe and love. "He's perfect," Daniel murmured, brushing a finger gently across the baby's cheek. "He is," Grace agreed, her voice soft. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes glistening. "And so are you." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Far from it." "No," she said, her tone firm. "You are. Because you fought for us, Daniel. You never gave up, even when it was hard. And that makes you perfect to me." Daniel leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grace. You're my everything." That night, under a blanket of stars, Daniel and Grace stood together in their backyard, their son bundled in a soft blanket in Grace's arms. The cool breeze rustled the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic created a serene backdrop. Daniel wrapped an arm around Grace's waist, pulling her close. "Look at this," he said softly, his eyes scanning the quiet street and the warm light spilling from their home. "I never thought I'd have this again, a family, a future. Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full. You deserve it, Daniel. We both do. As they stood there, the baby stirred, letting out a tiny yawn that made both of them laugh quietly. You think he knows how loved he is? Daniel asked, his voice tinged with wonder. Grace smiled, her gaze shifting to their son. He'll never doubt it, not for a second. Daniel looked down at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. Neither will you. I promise, Grace. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you and for him. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she nodded. I know. They stood in peaceful silence, the weight of their journey lifting as they looked toward the future. The struggles they had faced, the judgment, the doubts, the fears, had only strengthened their bond, forging a love that was unbreakable. And as the stars shimmered above, Grace and Daniel knew they had finally found what they had been searching for all along, a home, a family, and a life filled with hope. As Grace and Daniel stood together under the starlit sky, holding their newborn son, their story reminds us of the power of resilience, love, and second chances. It's a testament to how hope can bloom, even in the darkest moments, and how believing in someone can help them rediscover their strength and purpose. This journey wasn't just about rebuilding lives. It was about creating a family, overcoming judgment, and embracing the beauty of unconditional love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that love and perseverance can change everything. And for more heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story where love, hope, and humanity come alive.